The sun was barely up when Charlie Morrison heard the screaming. He dropped his coffee cup and ran toward the corral, knowing exactly what he'd find. Sure enough, there was Billy Thompson on the ground, clutching his shoulder and moaning in pain. The massive black horse stood in the center of the pen, snorting and pawing the dirt like he owned the place. This was the third man in 2 weeks, the third good cowboy who thought he could handle what everyone called the devil horse. Billy was lucky, though. At least he was still breathing. Charlie looked at the giant animal and shook his head. The horse was beautiful, no doubt about that. Pure black coat that shined like oil in the morning light, muscles that rippled under his skin like he was carved from stone. He stood almost 6 feet tall at his shoulders, bigger than any horse Charlie had ever seen. But those eyes, those wild, angry eyes, told a different story. "Boss, we gotta do something about that horse now," said Tom, Charlie's foreman. He was helping Billy to his feet, the injured man's face pale as milk. "He's gonna kill somebody if we keep this up." Charlie nodded but didn't answer right away. He'd been thinking the same thing for months now. Ever since the horse showed up at his ranch in Thunder Valley, Wyoming, nothing had been the same. The year was 1923, and Charlie had been raising horses and cattle on this land for 15 years. He'd seen wild horses before, plenty of them, but nothing like this. The story of how the horse came to his ranch was strange enough. A traveling horse trader named Pete had shown up one evening, leading the giant black stallion behind his wagon. The horse was already showing signs of trouble then, fighting the rope and trying to bite anyone who got close. Pete claimed he'd bought the animal from a ranch down in Colorado, but something about his story didn't add up. "This here's a special horse," Pete had said, sweat dripping down his face as he struggled to control the animal. "Strong as an ox, fast as the wind. Just needs the right man to handle him." Charlie should have known better. Any horse that made an experienced trader nervous was probably more trouble than it was worth. But the animal was magnificent, and Charlie had always had a soft spot for difficult horses. He paid Pete $50 for the stallion, thinking he could break him in a few weeks. That was 6 months ago. In those 6 months, the horse had earned his reputation as the meanest, most dangerous animal in 3 counties. Cowboys came from as far as Montana just to try their luck with him. None of them lasted more than a few seconds in the saddle, if they even made it that far. The horse didn't just buck like a normal wild horse. He fought like he was trying to kill whoever got near him. He'd rear up on his hind legs higher than seemed possible, then crash down with enough force to break bones. He'd spin and kick and bite with a fury that seemed almost human in its anger. But the worst part wasn't what he did to the men who tried to ride him. It was what he did to the other horses. 2 months ago, Charlie had made the mistake of putting him in the same pasture as his other stallions. He thought maybe having company would calm the black horse down. Instead, the animal had attacked a beautiful paint horse named Dusty, Charlie's prize-breeding stallion. The fight was over in minutes, and Dusty never got up again. A week later, it happened again with a young mare. This time, Charlie and his men managed to separate them before the black horse could do serious damage. But the mare was hurt bad enough that Doc Williams had to put her down. After that, Charlie built a special corral just for the black horse, high wooden walls reinforced with steel, strong enough to hold a bull. The horse spent his days pacing back and forth like a caged wolf, watching everything with those fierce, intelligent eyes. Word about the horse spread fast in a place like Thunder Valley. Cowboys loved to talk, especially about anything dangerous or unusual. Soon, people were riding out to Charlie's ranch just to get a look at the animal everyone was calling the devil horse, or the black demon. Some folks said the horse was cursed. Old Martha, who lived in town and claimed she could see the future, swore the animal had evil spirits living inside him. Others said he was just plain crazy, driven mad by cruel treatment from his previous owners. Looking at the horse now, as Billy Thompson limped away holding his injured shoulder, Charlie could see why people thought that. The animal's coat was covered with old scars, long, thin marks that could only have come from whips, rope burns around his legs where he'd been tied too tight for too long. His ears were notched from fights, and there was a deep scar across his nose that looked like it came from a branding iron used the wrong way. Somebody had hurt this horse bad, and now he was taking it out on everyone who came near. "Maybe we should just shoot him," Tom suggested, not for the first time. "Put him out of his misery." Charlie winced. He'd been thinking the same thing, but every time he looked at the horse, he saw something that stopped him. Under all that anger and violence, there was still something noble about the animal. The way he held his head high like he was proud even in his rage. The intelligence in his eyes that seemed almost human. "Not yet," Charlie said. "Give me a little more time to think about it." But time was running out. Billy Thompson's injury was serious enough that Doc Williams said he might not be able to use his arm properly again. Word was getting around that Charlie Morrison's ranch was a dangerous place. Some of his regular hands were talking about finding work elsewhere. And then there was the money problem. Keeping the horse was expensive. He ate more than 3 normal horses, and Charlie had to keep replacing the boards he kicked out of his corral. The special reinforced pen had cost more to build than Charlie spent on horse facilities in a normal year. Worse, the horse was affecting the other animals. The cattle wouldn't graze in the pasture next to his corral. The other horses were nervous and jumpy. Like they could sense the black stallion's anger even from a distance. Charlie's wife, Helen, had been after him for weeks to get rid of the animal. "That horse is going to ruin us," she said every morning over breakfast. "Either he's going to kill someone and we'll get sued, or he's going to drive away all our good workers. Either way, we'll lose everything." She was probably right. Charlie knew that. But something kept him from giving up on the horse completely. Maybe it was stubbornness. Charlie had always been the kind of man who didn't like to admit defeat. He'd built his ranch from nothing, survived drought and harsh winters and cattle rustlers. The idea of being beaten by one horse, no matter how mean, didn't sit well with him. Or maybe it was something else. Sometimes when Charlie looked at the black stallion, he thought he saw something familiar, a kind of pain that went deeper than physical scars. The horse reminded him of men he'd known who came back from the war changed, carrying wounds that nobody else could see. Whatever the reason, Charlie wasn't ready to give up yet. But he was running out of options. That afternoon, he sent Tom into town to put up notices in the saloon and the general store. The message was simple: wanted experienced horseman to break dangerous stallion. $500 reward for success. Serious inquiries only. $500 was more money than most cowboys saw in a year. It was certainly more than Charlie could afford to lose. But if someone could turn the black horse into a working animal, he'd be worth 10 times that much. The horse had the build and bloodline to sire a whole generation of strong, fast horses. As Tom rode toward town, Charlie walked back to the special corral. The black horse was standing at the far end, watching him with those intense, angry eyes. For just a moment, their gazes met, and Charlie could swear he saw something besides rage in the animal's expression. It might have been hope, or maybe it was just wishful thinking. Either way, Charlie knew that time was running out. Winter was coming, and he couldn't afford to keep feeding and housing a horse that might never be anything more than a beautiful, dangerous liability. The notices Tom was posting in town would bring more cowboys, more men willing to risk their lives for a chance at $500. But Charlie had a feeling that whatever happened next would determine not just the horse's fate, but the future of his ranch as well. The black stallion snorted and turned away, going back to his endless pacing. Charlie watched him for a few more minutes, then headed back to the house, hoping that somewhere out there was a man skilled enough and brave enough to solve his problem. He had no way of knowing that such a man was already on his way, carrying nothing but heartbreak, determination, and a simple gold ring that meant more to him than life itself. Jake Sullivan had been staring at the same fence post for 20 minutes, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. The hammer hung loose in his hand as he thought about the notice Tom had shown him that morning. $500, more money than Jake had ever seen at one time. The baby started crying again from inside the small cabin behind him. Little Annie had been fussy all morning, probably because she could sense her father's worry. At 6 months old, she didn't understand why her mama never came home, or why they'd had to move into this tiny place that leaked when it rained. Jake set down his hammer and walked inside to pick up his daughter. She quieted down as soon as he held her, her tiny fist wrapping around his calloused finger. Looking at her face so much like her mother's, Jake felt that familiar ache in his chest. Beth had been gone 6 months now. 6 months since the difficult birth that took her away and left Jake alone with a newborn baby, and more sadness than one man should have to carry. The doctor had said there was nothing anyone could have done, that sometimes these things just happened. But knowing that didn't make the empty space in Jake's heart any smaller. Money had been tight even when Beth was alive. Jake made $30 a month working as a ranch hand for various spreads around Thunder Valley. It was enough to get by when there were 2 of them. But now he had to pay old Mrs. Patterson $5 a week just to watch Annie while he worked. That left him $25 a month to pay for everything else: food, rent on the little cabin, clothes for a growing baby, and the medicine Annie needed when she got sick. Last month, she'd gotten a fever that scared Jake half to death. Doc Williams charged him $8 to come out and check on her, money Jake didn't have. He'd had to trade his good saddle to pay the bill, and now he was riding an old borrowed one that hurt his back after a long day's work. Winter was coming, and Jake knew he wasn't ready for it. The cabin was drafty, and he didn't have money for enough firewood to keep it warm. Annie would need warmer clothes, and the milk she was drinking cost more every week. Jake had been doing everything he could to make extra money. He worked weekends when he could find jobs, helped neighbors with their harvest, even took in washing when his pride would let him. But it wasn't enough. Every week he fell a little further behind. That's when Tom showed him the notice about the horse. "You ever seen this animal?" Tom asked, pointing to the paper. "Charlie Morrison's got himself a real devil on 4 legs. Been through more cowboys than a bucking contest." Jake had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in the valley knew about the black horse that nobody could ride. Some said he was the meanest horse that ever lived. Others claimed he was cursed or crazy. $500, Jake said, reading the number again to make sure he hadn't imagined it. "Yeah, but don't get any ideas," Tom warned. "That horse has put 3 men in the hospital already. Billy Thompson can barely use his right arm anymore. Doc says the bones didn't set right." But Jake was already thinking. $500 would solve everything. He could pay off his debts, buy enough supplies to get through the winter, maybe even put some money aside for Annie's future. It would mean security, at least for a while. "What exactly does Morrison want?" Jake asked. "Horse has got to be broken proper," Tom explained. "Not just rode once, but actually trained so he can be handled regular. Morrison figures if someone can do that, the horse would be worth a fortune for breeding." Jake nodded, but his mind was already working through the problems. He'd need money just to enter Morrison's challenge. The notice said interested parties had to put up collateral, something valuable to prove they were serious. Morrison didn't want every drifter and drunk cowboy wasting his time. The only thing Jake owned that was worth anything was his wedding ring. It wasn't much to look at, just a simple gold band that had belonged to Beth's grandmother. Beth's father had given it to Jake the day they got engaged, saying it was the most valuable thing the family owned. Jake had worn it every day since Beth died, turning it around his finger when he missed her most. The idea of giving it up, even temporarily, made him feel sick. But what choice did he have? That evening, after he'd put Annie to bed, Jake sat at his small kitchen table and tried to think of another way. He'd already sold everything else worth selling. His good horse, his extra saddle, Beth's jewelry except for her simple cross necklace that Annie would have someday. There was nothing left. He pulled out a pencil and a scrap of paper and tried to work out the numbers. If he could somehow make it through the winter on what he had, maybe by spring things would get better. Maybe he could find steadier work. Or maybe Annie would be old enough that Mrs. Patterson wouldn't charge as much to watch her. But every time he added up the figures, they came up short. Without some kind of miracle, they weren't going to make it. Jake walked to the window and looked out at the dark valley. Somewhere out there was a horse that had defeated every man who'd tried to tame him. A horse so dangerous that experienced cowboys wouldn't go near him anymore. But Jake had grown up around horses. His father had been a horse trainer before he died, and he'd taught Jake that every horse could be understood if you knew how to listen. Some horses were mean because they'd been treated cruel. Others were scared or hurt or just needed someone to show them patience. Jake had a way with difficult animals. Always had. When he was younger, before he got married and settled down, he'd made extra money gentling horses that other people had given up on. He was good at it, better than most. But this black stallion was different from anything he'd ever faced. The next morning, Jake rode out to Morrison's ranch to take a look at the horse for himself. He left Annie with Mrs. Patterson, promising he'd be back by evening. Morrison's spread was one of the biggest in the valley, with a nice ranch house and well-built barns and corrals. Jake could see cattle dotting the hillsides and horses grazing in several pastures. It was the kind of place Jake dreamed of owning someday, back when he still allowed himself to dream about the future. The special corral was easy to spot. It was built like a fortress, with walls higher and thicker than any horse pen Jake had ever seen. As he got closer, he could hear the sound of hooves pounding against wood. Then he saw the horse. Jake had expected a big animal, But this was something else entirely. The stallion was massive, easily the largest horse Jake had ever laid eyes on. His coat was so black it seemed to absorb the sunlight, and his muscles moved under his skin like water. When he ran, which he was doing now, racing back and forth along the fence, his hooves struck the ground like thunder. But it was the horse's eyes that stopped Jake cold. They weren't the vacant stare of a simple animal. There was intelligence there and pain, and a kind of fury that seemed almost human in its intensity. As Jake watched, the horse suddenly stopped running and looked straight at him. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the distance. Jake felt like the horse was measuring him, trying to figure out what kind of man he was. Impressive, ain't he? Jake turned to see Charlie Morrison walking up behind him. The ranch owner was a tall man with gray hair and kind eyes that looked tired. He's something all right, Jake admitted. How long you had him? 6 months too long, Morrison said with a bitter laugh. Cost me more money and headaches than any animal ought to. You thinking about trying for the reward? Jake nodded. Thinking about it, Morrison studied him carefully. Jake was a small man, barely 5.5 feet tall and lean as a whip. He didn't look like much compared to the big, strong cowboys who usually took on challenges like this. You got any experience with difficult horses? Morrison asked. Some, Jake said. He didn't mention that most of his experience was with horses that were difficult, not dangerous. There was a difference, and they both knew it. Well, if you're serious, you'll need to put up collateral, Morrison explained. Something worth $50 just to show you mean business. Too many men come around here thinking they can handle that horse without really understanding what they're getting into. Jake's hand went automatically to his wedding ring, spinning it around his finger. $50. The ring was probably worth that much, maybe more. What exactly are the rules? Jake asked. Simple enough, Morrison said. You've got to be able to ride him and control him. Not just stay on his back for a few seconds, but actually handle him like a working horse. If you can do that, the $500 is yours. If you can't, Morrison shrugged. Well, I keep the collateral and you get whatever medical bills come up. Jake nodded, but his attention was back on the horse. The animal was standing still now, still watching him with those intense eyes. Something about the way he held himself reminded Jake of wounded soldiers he'd seen, men who'd been hurt so bad they didn't trust anyone anymore. I'll need some time to think about it, Jake said finally. Don't take too long, Morrison replied. I can't afford to keep feeding that horse much longer. If nobody can break him soon, I'm going to have to put him down. The words hit Jake like a punch in the stomach. Put him down. This magnificent, powerful animal would be killed because nobody could reach him. That night, Jake sat up late thinking. Annie slept peacefully in her little bed, unaware that her father was making the most important decision of both their lives. The first day, Jake just sat and talked. He arrived at Morrison's ranch before sunrise, carrying a thermos of coffee and some biscuits Mrs. Patterson had made. The black horse was already awake, standing in the middle of his corral like a statue carved from shadow. When he saw Jake coming, his ears went back and he moved to the far side of the pen. Jake didn't try to get closer. Instead, he found his spot from the day before, settled down in the dirt about 10 feet from the fence and started talking. Morning, horse, he said quietly. Beautiful day, isn't it? Little cold, but the sun's coming up nice. The stallion watched him suspiciously, muscles tense and ready to explode into violence. But Jake just sipped his coffee and kept talking in the same calm, gentle voice he used when Annie was fussy. I've got a little girl, he told the horse, 6 months old. Her name's Annie, and she's got the prettiest blue eyes you ever saw, just like her mama had. Jake spent the whole morning there, talking about Beth and Annie, about his childhood on his father's small horse ranch, about anything that came to mind. The horse never came closer, but he never looked away either. Those intelligent eyes stayed fixed on Jake, as if he was trying to figure out what this strange human was up to. Around noon, Jake got up slowly and walked back to where his horse was tied. I'll see you tomorrow, big fellow, he called over his shoulder. The black stallion watched him go, then went back to his endless pacing. Day 2 was the same. Jake arrived early, sat in his spot, and talked. This time he brought a book of poems that had belonged to Beth. He read them out loud, his voice carrying across the morning air. The horse seemed to like the rhythm of the words. He stopped pacing and stood still, listening. You like that? Jake asked. Beth always said I had a good reading voice. She used to make me read to her in the evenings, especially after we found out about the baby. By the 3rd day, the horse was waiting for him, Jake could see the dark shape standing by the fence when he rode up in the pre-dawn darkness. The stallion watched Jake dismount and walk over to his usual spot, then settled down to listen. "Well, good morning to you too," Jake said with a smile. "Looks like we're getting somewhere." That morning, Jake tried something different. Instead of just talking, he started humming. Old songs his mother had sung to him when he was little. Lullabies Beth had hummed to Annie. The horse's ears swiveled forward, and Jake could swear he saw some of the tension leave those powerful shoulders. On the fourth day, Jake brought apples. He sat in his usual spot and ate his breakfast, making sure the horse could see the bright red fruit. When he was done eating, he held up an apple and looked at the stallion. "You hungry, boy? This is a good one. Sweet and crispy." Jake set the apple on the ground about halfway between himself and the fence, then moved back to his spot. The horse stared at the fruit for a long time, clearly wanting it but not trusting the situation. It took 2 hours, but eventually, hunger won out over caution. The stallion approached the fence carefully, ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. He stretched his neck as far as he could and managed to grab the apple with his teeth, then quickly moved away to eat it. "Good boy," Jake said softly. "That wasn't so hard, was it?" Day 5 brought the first real breakthrough. Jake had been talking about Beth's garden, how she'd grown the best tomatoes in the valley, when he noticed the horse moving closer to the fence. Not just to get food this time, but actually approaching Jake's position. Jake kept talking, pretending not to notice, but his heart was racing. The massive stallion came within 5 feet of the fence, close enough that Jake could see the details of his scars. There were so many of them. Whip marks across his flanks, rope burns around his legs, a deep gash across his nose that looked like it had been made by a branding iron used in anger. "Someone hurt you bad, didn't they?" Jake said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "Made you mean because they were mean first." The horse's ears flicked at the sound of Jake's voice, but he didn't move away. For the first time, Jake saw something besides anger in those dark eyes. It might have been sadness or recognition or just exhaustion from carrying so much pain. That evening, Jake stayed later than usual. As the sun set, he started singing softly. Old cowboy songs, church hymns Beth had loved, anything that came to mind. The horse stood by the fence and listened until full dark, then disappeared into the shadows at the back of his corral. By the end of the first week, Jake was bringing extra apples and carrots. The horse would come to the fence as soon as Jake arrived, waiting for his treats and his daily conversation. He still wouldn't let Jake touch him, but he was no longer afraid. The second week brought rain. Jake showed up anyway, wearing his old slicker and carrying an oiled canvas to sit on. The horse seemed surprised to see him in the downpour, as if he'd expected Jake to abandon him when conditions got difficult. "Can't let a little water stop us now," Jake told him, settling into his soggy spot. "We've got too much work to do." That day, Jake talked about his father's methods for training difficult horses. "Dad always said you had to think like the horse," Jake explained, wiping rain from his face. "Figure out what they're afraid of, what they need, what they're trying to tell you. Most horses that act mean are just scared or hurt or confused." The stallion stood as close to the fence as he could get without getting soaked, listening to every word. "He told me once that every horse has a story," Jake continued, "and if you're patient enough to learn their story, you can help them write a better ending." On the 10th day, everything changed. Jake arrived to find the horse agitated, pacing and snorting like he had in the early days. At first, Jake thought they'd lost all their progress, but then he noticed what was wrong. There was a cut on the horse's leg, probably from a loose nail or splintered board. It wasn't deep, but it was bleeding, and the horse was clearly in pain. Jake stood up slowly and moved to the fence. "Easy, boy," he said. "Let me see what's wrong." The horse came to the fence but shied away when Jake reached toward the injured leg. They stayed like that for several minutes, Jake with his hand extended, the horse torn between wanting help and fearing it. Finally, trust won out over fear. The stallion took a step forward and allowed Jake to examine the cut. It was clean, just a shallow gash that would heal fine if it was kept clean. "That's not too bad," Jake said gently, his fingers barely touching the horse's leg. "We need to clean it up, though." Jake had brought his lunch in a metal pail that morning. He dumped out the food, walked to the water trough, and filled the pail with clean water. The horse watched nervously as Jake approached again but didn't move away. "This might sting a little," Jake warned, then gently poured the water over the cut. The horse flinched, but stood still. Jake used his clean handkerchief to carefully dab away the blood and dirt, talking softly the whole time. "There we go. All clean now. You're going to be just fine." When he was done, Jake looked up to find the horse's face just inches from his own. Those dark eyes that had been so full of rage and pain now held something different, something that looked like gratitude. Jake slowly raised his hand and placed it on the horse's nose. The stallion didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into the touch as if he'd been starving for gentle human contact. "That's my boy," Jake whispered, tears running down his cheeks. "That's my good boy." From that moment on, everything was different. The horse would come to the fence as soon as he saw Jake coming, nickering softly in greeting. He let Jake pet his nose, then his neck, then gradually his whole head and shoulders. Jake discovered that the stallion loved having his ears scratched and would close his eyes in pleasure when Jake found the right spot. But the real revelation came when Jake started talking about the horses. "Past, I think I know what happened to you," Jake said one morning, running his hands over the scars. "Someone tried to break you the hard way. Ropes and whips and pain made you so angry you forgot how to trust." The horse stood perfectly still, as if he was listening to his own story being told for the first time. "But that's not who you really are, is it?" Jake continued. "Under all that anger, you're just a horse who wants to be loved. Just like the rest of us." By the third week, Jake was spending most of each day at the corral. He'd arranged with Morrison to do odd jobs around the ranch in exchange for being near the horse. Mrs. Patterson was watching Annie longer hours, but she'd agreed to a reduced rate when Jake explained what he was trying to do. The breakthrough came on day 21. Jake had been working with a rope, letting the horse see it and smell it, getting him used to the idea without trying to put it on him. The stallion was nervous about the rope, memories of past cruelty making his eyes roll with fear. "It's okay," Jake said softly. "This rope isn't going to hurt you. I'm not going to hurt you." He draped the rope over the fence, then over his own shoulders, showing the horse that it was harmless. Gradually, he let the horse sniff it, then touch it with his nose. Finally, moving slower than he'd ever moved in his life, Jake slipped the rope around the horse's neck. The stallion tensed, ready to explode, but Jake's voice was there, calm and steady. "Easy, boy, easy, you're safe. I've got you and you're safe." The horse stood trembling, every muscle coiled like a spring, but he didn't fight. For the first time in his life, he was wearing a rope put on him with kindness instead of force. Word spread fast in a valley like Thunder Valley. By the time Jake had been working with the horse for 3 weeks, everyone within 50 miles knew that the small cowboy with the sad eyes was trying something different with Morrison's devil horse. Most folks thought he was either very brave or very foolish. Some thought he was both. Charlie Morrison had been watching Jake's progress with growing amazement and concern. Amazing because the horse was actually responding to gentle treatment. Concerning because Morrison had promised $500 to whoever could break the stallion, and he wasn't sure he could afford to pay that much. But a promise was a promise. And Morrison was a man of his word. "You really think you can ride him?" Morrison asked Jake one morning. They were standing by the corral watching the horse, who now came to the fence whenever he saw Jake approaching. Jake looked at the massive stallion and felt that familiar flutter of fear in his stomach. The horse was still enormous, still powerful enough to kill a man without trying very hard. But the rage was gone from his eyes, replaced by something that looked almost like affection when he looked at Jake. "I think so," Jake said quietly, "but I need to do it my way in my own time." Morrison nodded. He'd learned to respect Jake's methods over the past weeks. The change in the horse was nothing short of miraculous. Where before there had been a dangerous, unpredictable animal, now there was something approaching a normal horse, still wild, still unbroken, but no longer filled with the kind of fury that made him want to hurt everything around him. The word was out that Jake Sullivan planned to attempt riding Morrison's black stallion, and people were coming from all over to watch. Some came out of curiosity, wanting to see if the quiet little cowboy could really do what bigger, stronger men had failed to accomplish. Others came expecting to see another disaster, another good man get hurt by the horse that had already put so many in the hospital. Jake tried not to think about the crowd that was gathering. His focus had to be entirely on the horse and the relationship they'd built together. But late at night, lying in his small cabin with Annie sleeping beside him, he couldn't help but worry about what would happen if he failed. If he couldn't ride the horse, Morrison would keep his wedding ring. Worse than that, Jake would be back where he started, broke and desperate with no prospects for making the money he needed to get through the winter, and if he got hurt. Jake tried not to think about what would happen to Annie if something happened to him. Mrs. Patterson was a kind woman, but she had her own family to worry about. There was no one else. No relatives who could take in a motherless baby. Everything depended on his ability to stay on the back of a horse that had thrown off every other man who'd tried. On the morning Jake planned to make his attempt, he woke before dawn and spent extra time getting ready. He shaved carefully, put on his best shirt, and braided his hair back so it wouldn't get in his eyes. If this was going to be his last day as a whole healthy man, he wanted to look respectable. Annie seemed to sense that something important was happening. She was unusually quiet as Jake fed her breakfast, her blue eyes watching his every move. "Daddy's got to go do something today, sweetheart," he told her as he got her ready to go to Mrs. Patterson's house. "Something important for both of us." He kissed her forehead and held her close for a long moment, breathing in the sweet baby smell of her hair. "I love you, Annie girl," he whispered. "No matter what happens, remember that your daddy loves you more than anything in this world." Mrs. Patterson took Annie with more fuss than usual, clearly worried about what Jake was planning to do. "You don't have to do this," she said for the 10th time. "There's got to be other ways to make money." Jake shook his head. Not $500 at once, and not in time for winter. He kissed Annie one more time and rode toward Morrison's ranch, his heart pounding with every step his horse took. By the time he arrived, there were already more than 30 people gathered around the special corral. Cowboys, townspeople, even some women and children who'd come to see the show. Jake recognized most of the faces, but seeing them all staring at him made his mouth go dry. "Quite a crowd," Morrison said, walking up beside him. "Word got out that today was the day." Jake nodded, not trusting his voice to work properly. Morrison reached into his pocket and pulled out Jake's wedding ring. The gold caught the morning sunlight, and Jake's chest tightened at the sight of it. "This is yours if you can ride him," Morrison said, "along with the $500. But Jake, if you change your mind, there's no shame in it. That horse is still dangerous no matter how gentle he's been with you." Jake looked at the ring, then at the crowd, then at the black stallion standing calmly in his corral. The horse was watching Jake with those intelligent eyes, as if he understood that today was different, that everything they'd worked toward was about to be tested. "I appreciate that, Mr. Morrison," Jake said finally, "but I've got to try." The crowd grew quiet as Jake walked toward the corral. Some of the men were placing bets on whether he'd last more than a few seconds. Others were taking odds on how badly he'd get hurt. Jake tried to block out their voices and focus on the horse. "Morning, boy," he said softly as he approached the fence. "Big day today." The stallion came to the fence immediately, lowering his head so Jake could scratch behind his ears. The familiar gesture calmed Jake's nerves a little. "Lots of people watching us," Jake continued, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "But it's still just you and me, isn't it? Just like it's been every day." Jake had brought a saddle, an old but well-maintained one that had belonged to his father. He'd spent hours the night before oiling the leather and checking every strap and buckle. Now he draped it over the fence where the horse could see and smell it. The stallion sniffed the saddle suspiciously, but didn't show the violent reaction Jake had been afraid of. Over the past week, Jake had been letting the horse get used to the idea of tack, showing him blankets and bridles, letting him investigate everything at his own pace. "Remember what we practiced," Jake said, opening the gate to the corral. A murmur went through the crowd. Several people started to back away, expecting the horse to charge out of the open pen, but the stallion stayed where he was, focused entirely on Jake. Jake entered the corral slowly, the saddle in his arms. The horse watched but didn't retreat. This was the moment Jake had been building toward for weeks, but it still felt like the most dangerous thing he'd ever done. "Easy, boy," he said, approaching with the saddle. "We've done this before, just not with all these people watching." He set the saddle on the horse's back gently, ready to jump away if the animal exploded into violence. But the horse just stood there, trembling slightly but not fighting. Jake worked quickly but calmly, tightening the cinch and adjusting the stirrups. The horse's skin twitched and his ears swiveled nervously, but he held still. "Good boy," Jake murmured. "You're doing so good." Now came the hardest part. Jake had never actually tried to mount the horse before. All their work together had been on the ground, building trust and communication. But riding was different. Riding meant being completely vulnerable, trusting the horse with his life. The crowd was dead silent now. Everyone understood that this was the moment that would determine success or failure. Jake put his hand on the saddle horn and looked into the horse's eyes. "This is it, big fellow," he said quietly. "Time to show everyone what we've learned together." He put his foot in the stirrup. The horse tensed but didn't move. Jake pulled himself slowly up into the saddle, every muscle in his body ready to bail off if the horse started to buck, but nothing happened. Jake settled into the saddle, gathered the reins, and sat perfectly still for a moment. The horse stood like a statue, as if he wasn't quite sure what to do now that he had a rider on his back. "Well," Jake said softly, "how does this feel?" He gently squeezed with his legs, asking the horse to move forward. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then slowly, carefully, the black stallion took a step forward. The crowd let out a collective gasp. This was the horse that had bucked off every other rider within seconds, the animal that had put strong men in the hospital. And here he was, walking calmly with Jake Sullivan on his back. Jake guided the horse around the corral, using the same gentle pressure and soft voice that had worked during their weeks of ground training. The stallion responded like he'd been doing this his whole life, turning left and right, stopping and starting, all at Jake's request. After a few minutes, Jake tried asking for a trot. The horse hesitated, then broke into the smoothest, most comfortable trot Jake had ever experienced. It was like riding a rocking chair, so smooth and rhythmic that Jake felt like he could sit there all day. The crowd was cheering now, but Jake barely heard them. His whole world had narrowed down to the horse beneath him, and the incredible feeling of harmony between them. This wasn't domination or conquest. This was partnership. Jake asked for a lope, and the horse obliged, his powerful strides eating up the ground around the corral. Still smooth, still controlled, still responsive to Jake's every signal. Finally, Jake brought the horse back to a walk, then to a complete stop in the center of the corral. He dismounted slowly, his legs shaking with adrenaline and relief. The $500 felt heavy in Jake's pocket as he walked away from the cheering crowd. It was more money than he'd ever held at one time, enough to solve all his immediate problems and give him breathing room to plan for the future. But as he looked back at Thunder standing calmly in the corral, Jake realized the money wasn't the most important thing he'd gained that day. Charlie Morrison caught up with him before he reached his horse. "Jake, wait a minute," Morrison called out. "I want to talk to you about something." Jake turned, wondering what else the rancher could possibly want to discuss. The challenge was over, the money was paid, and Thunder was officially broken and rideable. "That was the most impressive piece of horse training I've ever seen," Morrison said seriously. "And I've been around horses my whole life. The way you handled that animal, it wasn't just breaking him, it was healing him." Jake nodded, not sure where the conversation was heading. "I've got a proposition for you," Morrison continued. "I need a head trainer for my horses. Someone who can work with the difficult ones, the ones that other people give up on. The job pays $60 a month plus a house on the property and feed for your own horses." Jake's jaw dropped. $60 a month was twice what he'd been making as a regular ranch hand, plus a house, which meant he wouldn't have to pay rent on the leaky little cabin where he and Annie had been struggling to get by. I don't know what to say," Jake stammered. "Say yes." Morrison grinned. "I've seen what you can do. And frankly, after watching you with Thunder, I think you could teach some of my other hands a thing or two about handling horses." Jake looked back at Thunder again. The big stallion was watching him as if he understood that his fate and Jake's were still connected. "What about Thunder?" Jake asked. "What happens to him now?" Morrison followed his gaze. "Well, that's up to you. Part of the job would be training him for breeding. A horse with his bloodline and temperament, now that he's manageable, could sire some of the finest horses in Wyoming. But if you're going to be working with him, I figure he ought to be your responsibility." The offer was everything Jake had dreamed of and more. A good job, a decent place to live, and the chance to work with Thunder every day. It would mean security for Annie, and a future that looked brighter than anything he'd dared hope for since Beth died. "Can I give you an answer tomorrow?" Jake asked. "I need to think about it, talk to Mrs. Patterson about Annie." "Of course," Morrison said. "Take all the time you need. But Jake, I hope you'll say yes. I think this could be the start of something good for all of us." That evening, Jake sat in his little cabin with Annie on his lap and the $500 spread out on the table in front of him. It was more money than he'd seen at one time in his entire life, but he found himself thinking less about the cash and more about Thunder. The horse had trusted him completely that morning, had stood still while Jake climbed onto his back, had responded to every signal with patience and intelligence. After weeks of gentle training, the violent, angry animal everyone had called a devil had revealed his true nature, a noble, powerful creature who had simply needed someone to treat him with kindness. It reminded Jake of something his father used to say: every living thing just wants to be understood and cared for. Even the meanest horse has a good heart somewhere inside if you're patient enough to find it. The next morning, Jake rode back to Morrison's ranch with Annie tucked in front of him in the saddle. He'd made his decision, but he wanted Thunder to meet the most important person in his life before he gave Morrison his answer. Thunder was standing by the fence when they arrived, and he nickered softly in greeting. Annie laughed and reached her tiny hands toward the big horse, showing no fear of the animal that had terrified grown men just weeks before. "Easy, sweetheart," Jake said, dismounting and lifting Annie down. "Let's introduce you properly." He carried Annie to the fence where Thunder lowered his massive head to investigate this small new human. Annie giggled and patted the horse's nose with her baby hands, and Thunder stood perfectly still, as gentle as a lamb. "I think he likes her," Morrison said, walking up behind them. "And she likes him," Jake replied, watching his daughter's face light up with delight as Thunder nuzzled her cheek. "So what do you say?" Morrison asked. "Ready to come work for me?" Jake looked at Annie, safe and happy in his arms. He looked at Thunder, calm and trusting. He thought about the little house Morrison had offered, with a real roof that didn't leak and a stone fireplace to keep them warm through the winter. "Yes," he said simply. "We'd like that very much." The transition happened quickly. Within a week, Jake and Annie had moved into the small but comfortable house Morrison provided. It had 2 bedrooms, a proper kitchen, and windows that looked out over the pastures where Morrison's horses grazed. For the first time since Beth died, Jake felt like he had a real home again. His work with Thunder continued, but now it had a different purpose. Instead of just proving the horse could be ridden, Jake was training him to be a working ranch horse and eventually a breeding stallion. Thunder took to the work with enthusiasm, as if he was grateful to finally have a job that matched his intelligence and strength. But the real surprise was how quickly Thunder adapted to having Annie around. The big stallion, who had once been too dangerous to approach, became the most patient babysitter Jake had ever seen. When Annie was learning to walk, Thunder would stand motionless as she used his legs to pull herself up. When she cried, the horse would come to the fence and nick her softly until she quieted down. "Never seen anything like it," Morrison said one afternoon, watching Thunder carefully move around the toddler who was playing in his pasture. "That horse would let that baby ride on his back if you let her." Jake smiled, remembering how his father had always said that horses were good judges of character. Thunder had recognized something special in Annie, just as he'd somehow known that Jake was different from the other men who'd tried to break him. Word of Jake's success with Thunder spread throughout Wyoming and beyond. Other ranchers began bringing their problem horses to Morrison's spread, knowing that Jake Sullivan had a gift for reaching animals that everyone else had given up on. Each horse was different, with its own story of fear or pain or misunderstanding, but Jake's patient approach worked time and again. Within 2 years, Jake had built a reputation as one of the finest horse trainers in the territory. Morrison raised his salary twice and eventually made him a partner in the horse training side of the business. They built a special facility for working with difficult horses, using methods based on patience and understanding rather than force and domination. But the most important changes were in Jake himself. The quiet, desperate man who had been willing to risk everything for $500 was gone, replaced by someone who had found his calling in life. Jake discovered that healing broken horses was healing something broken in himself as well. Each success, each moment when a frightened animal learned to trust again, reminded him that even the worst pain could be overcome with time and care. Annie grew up surrounded by horses, learning to ride almost before she could walk properly. Thunder was her special favorite, and the massive stallion seemed to understand that this little girl was the most precious thing in Jake's world. He was gentle with her in a way that amazed everyone who saw them together. One evening when Annie was 3 years old, she was playing in Thunder's pasture while Jake repaired a section of fence. The little girl had wandered closer to the edge of the property than usual, and Jake was keeping one eye on her while he worked. Suddenly, Thunder raised his head and let out a sharp whinny. His ears pointed toward Annie. Jake looked up to see a rattlesnake coiled in the grass just a few feet from his daughter, its tail buzzing a warning. Before Jake could even call out, Thunder was moving. The big stallion charged toward the snake, placing himself between the reptile and the little girl. He reared up and came down with his front hooves, striking the ground near the snake until it slithered away into the brush. Only then did Thunder turn to Annie, gently nudging her away from the area with his nose, guiding her back toward Jake. That night, as Jake tucked Annie into her bed, she asked him about Thunder's behavior. "Why did Thunder scare away the snake, Daddy?" "Because he loves you," Jake said simply. "And because he knows how much Daddy loves you. Thunder protects the people he cares about. Like you protected Thunder when the other cowboys were mean to him." Jake was surprised by her perceptiveness. At 3, Annie was already showing signs of having inherited her father's ability to understand horses and their behavior. "That's right, sweetheart," he said. "Sometimes when someone has been hurt, they need extra patience and love to help them heal. Thunder was angry and scared when I first met him, but underneath all that anger was a good heart. Are you going to teach me to help horses like Thunder?" Jake smiled and kissed her forehead. "If that's what you want to learn, I'll teach you everything I know." Years passed and Jake's reputation continued to grow. He wrote letters to horse trainers across the country, sharing his methods and learning from others who believed in gentle training techniques. Morrison's ranch became known as a place where hopeless horses could find new lives.